A doctor fell in love with a coma patient she had never met. When he woke up, he called her by her full name and said she looked beautiful as always. She swore she had never seen him before in her life. But when the truth came to light, shocking revelations about their past changed everything forever, in a way no one could have imagined. A story of lost love, erased memories, and second chances. Get ready, because this story will touch your heart. Subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and comment where you're watching from. That suffocating afternoon in late spring, when the hospital fans could no longer compete with the weight of the humid air, Dr. Sarah Mitchell entered the ICU as she did every day, with firm steps but a heart in ruins. 3 months had passed since her silent separation, and no one there knew what she was hiding behind her reading glasses and brief smiles. Until a new patient arrived, unconscious, rushed in after collapsing at a train station. No documents, no companion, only a silver ring on his finger and a crumpled note in his pocket, with the phrase written in careful handwriting, "If I don't wake up, look for her." But who would she be? And why did this note seem inexplicably to speak directly to her? She didn't know his name, but something about that peaceful face disturbed her. It was as if time stopped around her when she checked his vital signs, adjusted the feeding tube, or changed the sheets. At first, she thought it was common empathy. After all, she was a doctor. But within days, the feeling transformed into something more. A silent connection, almost spiritual. She began reading to him, touching his hand, bringing soft music on a small portable radio, as if she wanted to wake him with beauty. But nothing made him react. The body alive, the eyes closed. The man appeared to be in his early 30s, with dark hair that fell slightly over his forehead, and hands that seemed to belong to someone who wrote or painted. There was something refined about his features, even in unconsciousness. Sarah found herself wondering about his story, what kind of life he had lived, what dreams filled his sleeping mind. The nursing staff had taken to calling him John Doe, but she refused to use that impersonal label. In her mind, she simply called him, as if he were someone she had always known. The days blended into one another in the sterile brightness of the ICU. Sarah's colleagues noticed she was spending more time than necessary with the mysterious patient, but they attributed it to her natural compassion. Dr. Mitchell had always been thorough, always caring. What they didn't see were the moments when she lingered by his bedside after her shift ended, speaking softly about her day, about the weather outside, about anything that might reach him in whatever place his consciousness had retreated to. Her marriage to David had ended quietly, without drama or raised voices, simply fading away like old photographs left in sunlight. They had been college sweethearts who grew into strangers sharing the same house. The divorce papers were signed on a Tuesday morning in April, and she had walked out of the lawyer's office feeling nothing but a hollow relief. Now, 3 months later, she was living alone in a small apartment near the hospital, trying to remember who she was when she wasn't someone's wife. 1 month after his arrival, the patient moved his fingers. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but enough to renew hope. The movement was so subtle that Sarah almost missed it, just a slight curl of his index finger against the white sheet. She called for the neurologist immediately, her heart racing with an excitement she couldn't quite understand. Dr. Peterson examined the patient thoroughly, adjusting medications and ordering new tests, but cautioned that such movements could be involuntary. What Sarah didn't expect was the reaction from nurse supervisor Janet Walsh, who immediately alerted the hospital's legal department. There was a strict protocol for unidentified patients, she explained with bureaucratic efficiency. The man was at risk of being transferred to a public institution if his identity couldn't be established soon. The insurance company was growing impatient, and the bed was needed for patients with proper documentation and coverage. Seized by an urgency she couldn't name, Sarah used a personal contact and managed to secure an additional month of care for him. Dr. James Hartwell, head of administration and an old family friend, agreed to extend the patient's stay as a special case, though he warned Sarah not to become too personally invested. She assured him it was purely professional concern, but even as she spoke the words, she knew they weren't entirely true. During this extended time, Sarah began experiencing vivid dreams about the patient. They were strange, almost lucid dreams where they walked together through fields of wildflowers, or stood waiting on a rain-soaked train platform, and he would smile at her with the familiarity of someone who had known her forever. She would wake from these dreams with tears on her cheeks, and a sense of loss she couldn't explain. But it wasn't love that consumed her most. It was doubt. Why did he seem so familiar? And why did everything about his presence make her remember someone she had lost years ago in a personal tragedy she still couldn't speak aloud? The feeling haunted her during her waking hours, a nagging sense that she was forgetting something important, something that might explain the inexplicable pull she felt toward this stranger. The hospital had become her entire world. Sarah arrived early and left late, finding excuses to check on him throughout the day. She brought different books to read aloud, testing whether poetry might reach him where medical texts had failed. She played classical music, then jazz, then soft folk songs, watching his face for any sign of recognition. Other staff members began to whisper, not unkindly, about Dr. Mitchell's dedication to the mysterious patient. Winter arrived early that year, coating Philadelphia in an unexpected snowfall that transformed the view from the ICU windows into a scene from a Christmas card. Sarah was adjusting his IV when it happened. His eyes opened slowly, focusing with surprising clarity, and he looked directly at her. But the shock that hit her wasn't from seeing him wake up. It was from what he said next. "You look beautiful, as always, Sarah." He knew her name. Her full name, spoken with the intimate familiarity of someone who had said it 1,000 times before. But she was certain, absolutely certain, that she had never met this man before in her life. The blood drained from her face as she stared at him, her hands trembling as she reached for the call button. "How do you know my name?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the beeping of the monitors. He smiled, a slow, gentle smile that seemed to hold secrets. "How could I forget?" The nursing staff rushed in as Sarah backed away from the bed, her heart pounding. Dr. Peterson was called immediately to examine the newly awakened patient, while Sarah retreated to the break room, her mind reeling. She had never mentioned her name in his presence, never introduced herself. The hospital ID badge she wore showed only Dr. Mitchell. How could he possibly know her first name? Over the following days, he recovered slowly, still experiencing gaps in his memory. He spoke in fragments about scattered recollections: a flower market on a Sunday morning, a porch with grapevines growing overhead, an argument that ended in silence, and always, memories of her. He described the way she laughed when she was truly happy, how she unconsciously touched her neck when she was nervous, the exact shade of green in her eyes when she was angry. Sarah was terrified by the accuracy of his observations. These weren't generic descriptions that could apply to anyone. They were specific, intimate details that only someone very close to her would know. But she swore, under oath if necessary, that she had never met him before that day he was brought to the ICU. The mystery deepened when his personal belongings were finally released by the police. Among them was a small notebook with a red leather cover, worn smooth from handling. Inside, page after page contained handwritten entries about her. Not about someone like her, but specifically about Dr. Sarah Mitchell. Her daily routines, her preferences, her fears, her dreams. Details that made her skin crawl and her heart race simultaneously. The entries were undated, written in a careful hand that spoke of patience and attention to detail. He knew that she preferred tea to coffee in the morning, that she listened to NPR during her commute, that she had a small scar on her left palm from a childhood accident involving a broken glass. He knew she was afraid of thunderstorms, but loved the rain, that she read mystery novels to fall asleep, that she kept a photograph of her grandmother on her bedside table. But perhaps most unsettling were the entries about her emotional state. He wrote about her loneliness during the last year of her marriage, her relief when David finally moved out, her uncertainty about the future. He described her better than she could describe herself, capturing nuances of feeling she had never shared with anyone. Dr. Peterson suggested that the patient might be suffering from a form of delusional disorder, that he had perhaps seen her photograph somewhere and constructed an elaborate fantasy around her. But Sarah knew there were no recent photographs of her in any public forum. She was a private person who avoided social media and had specifically requested that her image not be used in any hospital promotional materials. The next revelation came through an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Eleanor Fairchild appeared at the hospital one gray morning, claiming to be the patient's aunt. She was an elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and eyes that held decades of worry. With tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, she told a confusing story about her nephew, whose name, she said, was Michael Chen. According to Mrs. Fairchild, Michael was a former writer who had suffered a traumatic brain injury years earlier and developed a rare form of episodic amnesia. The condition caused him to constantly rewrite his life story, blending reality with fiction in ways that even he couldn't always distinguish. "This would explain the notebook," she said, tears making her voice shake. He often created detailed fantasies about people he glimpsed in passing, weaving elaborate relationships that existed only in his damaged mind. But Sarah couldn't accept this explanation. Something deep inside her, perhaps her heart, perhaps some instinct she didn't understand, insisted that there was more to this story. The details in his notebook weren't the random observations of a stranger. They were the intimate knowledge of someone who had shared her life. The weeks passed in a strange suspension between professional duty and personal confusion. Michael, as she now called him, continued to recover his physical strength while his memories remained frustratingly fragmented. The bond between them grew despite her efforts to maintain professional distance. He seemed to anticipate her thoughts before she expressed them, offering comfort when she was stressed, making her laugh with observations about the hospital staff that were both kind and perfectly accurate. One evening, as they walked through the quiet corridors of the hospital during his physical therapy, Michael shared a recurring dream he had experienced during his coma. In the dream, he told her, they were married. They lived together in a house by the ocean, white with blue shutters and a garden full of roses. They had a simple but happy routine, sharing morning coffee on the porch, reading books in comfortable silence, walking on the beach at sunset. As she listened to him describe this dream life, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of longing for something she couldn't identify. It wasn't just attraction to this mysterious man. It was a deep sadness for a life she felt she should remember but couldn't. The dream he described felt more real to her than many of her actual memories. That night, Sarah went home to her small apartment and stood before her bedroom dresser, looking at the framed photograph she kept there. It was an old picture of a beach house from her childhood, a place her family had rented every summer until she was 12. The house was white with blue shutters, just as Michael had described. A house she had never mentioned to anyone at the hospital. A house she hadn't thought about in years. The coincidence left her shaking. She sat on her bed and stared at the photograph until her eyes blurred with tears. How could he have known about this place? How could he have described it so perfectly in a dream about a life they had supposedly never shared? Unable to sleep, Sarah found herself searching through old boxes stored in her closet, looking for something she couldn't name. In the bottom of a trunk that had followed her through 3 moves, she found a leather portfolio filled with programs from college theater productions. She had been involved in drama during her undergraduate years, before switching to pre-med, and these programs were the only evidence of that brief artistic period. Flipping through the old programs, her hands stopped when she reached one from a production of Romeo and Juliet from her sophomore year. There, in the cast list, was her name, Sarah Mitchell, Juliet, and below it, Michael Chen, Romeo. The photograph showed the entire cast, and there in the front row, she saw herself at 19, standing next to a young man who looked remarkably like the patient sleeping in the ICU. The program was dated 15 years ago. She stared at the photograph until the faces blurred together, trying desperately to remember. There was something there, just beyond the edge of her consciousness, like trying to recall a word that sits on the tip of your tongue. She knew this face, she was certain now, but the memory remained frustratingly out of reach. Sarah spent the rest of the night searching through more boxes, finding fragments of her college years she had forgotten. There were photographs from cast parties, newspaper clippings of reviews, even some handwritten notes passed between cast members during rehearsals. In several of the photographs, she and Michael stood together, sometimes in costume, sometimes in casual clothes, always looking comfortable with each other. But despite the photographic evidence, she couldn't summon any actual memories of knowing him. It was as if that entire period of her life existed behind a wall in her mind, visible but untouchable. The frustration was almost unbearable, like being locked out of her own past. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the hospital early, clutching the theater program in her hands. She found Michael sitting up in bed, looking out the window at the city waking up below. When she showed him the program, his face lit up with a joy she had never seen before. "You remember?" he said softly, reaching out to touch the old photograph. "No," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I don't remember anything, but I found this, and I need to understand what happened to us." Michael studied her face with infinite gentleness. "There was an accident," he said slowly. "During our final rehearsal, part of the set collapsed. You were hurt very badly." As he spoke, Sarah felt something shifting in her mind, like ice beginning to crack. She had a vague memory of being in a hospital as a young woman, though she had always attributed it to appendicitis. But now, looking at this man who claimed to know her so well, she wondered if there might be other memories buried beneath the surface of her consciousness. "You were in the hospital for weeks," Michael continued, his voice thick with old pain. "When you finally woke up, you didn't remember the accident, or the play, or—" He paused, swallowing hard. "Or me." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She sank into the chair beside his bed, the theater program falling from her nerveless fingers. "What were we to each other?" she whispered. Michael's eyes filled with tears. "We were going to be married." Sarah felt the world tilt around her. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge she was afraid to cross. Engaged. They had been engaged 15 years ago, and she couldn't remember any of it. Not the proposal, not the planning, not the love that must have brought them to that decision. The absence of those memories felt like a physical ache in her chest. "I don't understand," she whispered, pressing her palms against her temples as if she could somehow force the memories to surface. "How can I forget something so important? How can I forget you?" Michael reached for her hand, and when their fingers touched, Sarah felt a jolt of recognition that seemed to bypass her conscious mind entirely. Her body remembered what her brain had forgotten, the familiar weight and warmth of his touch. "The doctor said it was trauma-induced amnesia," Michael explained gently. "The injury affected your memory of the weeks leading up to the accident. Our entire relationship happened during your senior year, just a few months before graduation. When you woke up, it was all gone." The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Sarah remembered changing her major from theater arts to pre-med during her senior year, a decision that had seemed sudden and inexplicable to her family. She remembered being told she had been hospitalized, though the details had always been fuzzy. She remembered the strange sense of loss she had carried for years without understanding its source. "What happened to you?" she asked, needing to understand why he had disappeared from her life. "Why didn't you try to help me remember?" Michael's face darkened with old pain. "I did try at first, but the doctors said pushing you to remember could be harmful. They recommended giving you space, letting your memories return naturally. Your parents—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Your parents thought it would be better if I stayed away. They were afraid that seeing me would traumatize you further." Sarah closed her eyes, imagining her younger self in a hospital bed, surrounded by concerned family members who made the decision to erase an entire relationship from her life. They had meant well, she knew that, but the cost of their protection was becoming clear. They had stolen her chance to choose, to fight for a love she couldn't even remember losing. "I waited for months," Michael continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I kept thinking you would call, that you would remember something and reach out, but you never did. Eventually, I had to accept that the Sarah I loved was gone." The weight of his loss hit her like a physical blow. While she had moved on with her life, rebuilding herself from the fragments she could remember, he had been left to grieve for a love that still existed but could never be reclaimed. No wonder he had been searching for her all these years. He had never gotten closure, never had the chance to say goodbye. Dr. Peterson entered the room with his usual brisk efficiency, interrupting the charged moment between them. He reviewed Michael's charts and pronounced himself satisfied with his recovery, then turned to Sarah with a concerned expression. "Dr. Mitchell, I need to speak with you privately," he said, his tone suggesting this wasn't a request. In the hallway outside Michael's room, Dr. Peterson's concern became more apparent. "Sarah, I'm worried about your involvement with this patient. I understand he claims to know you, but you need to consider the possibility that he's delusional. Patients with traumatic brain injuries often create elaborate fantasies." "But the photographs," Sarah protested. "The theater program. We were clearly in college together. That doesn't mean his memories of your relationship are accurate," Dr. Peterson replied firmly. "Head trauma can cause people to conflate casual acquaintanceships with deep relationships. He may genuinely believe you were engaged, but that doesn't make it true." Sarah wanted to argue, to insist that what she felt between them was real, but doubt crept in like a cold wind. How could she trust feelings for someone she couldn't remember? How could she separate truth from fantasy when her own memories were so unreliable? That evening, Sarah called her mother for the first time in weeks. Helen Mitchell lived in a retirement community in Florida now, but her voice still carried the strength that had guided Sarah through her teenage years in college. "Mom, I need to ask you about my accident in college," Sarah said without preamble. "The one that put me in the hospital senior year." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Why are you asking about that now, sweetheart? It was so long ago." "I need to know about Michael Chen." Sarah pressed. Were we really engaged? Another pause, longer this time. When Helen spoke again, her voice was heavy with old regret. Oh, Sarah. We hoped you would never have to remember that pain. The admission hit Sarah like a punch to the stomach. So it's true? We were engaged? You were so young, Helen said defensively. Only 21. And you barely knew each other. You'd only been dating for a few months when he proposed. We thought it was too fast, too intense. When the accident happened and you couldn't remember him, we saw it as a chance for you to start fresh, to make better choices. Sarah sank into her kitchen chair, the phone pressed against her ear as her world shifted beneath her. You made the choice for me. You decided my life wasn't worth fighting for. We were protecting you, Helen insisted, but there was uncertainty in her voice now. The boy was devastated, of course, but he was young too. We thought he would move on, find someone else. We never imagined he would spend 15 years searching for you. The conversation ended badly, with Sarah hanging up on her mother for the first time in her adult life. She sat in her dark kitchen, staring out at the city lights, trying to process the magnitude of what had been taken from her. Not just the memories, but the choice. Her family had decided that her love wasn't worth preserving, that she was better off starting over as a blank slate. But even as anger burned in her chest, Sarah had to admit that Dr. Peterson's warnings echoed in her mind. What if Michael's memories were distorted by his own trauma? What if the intense young love he remembered had been magnified by years of idealization? How could she trust feelings that might be built on a foundation of mutual delusion? The next few days passed in a blur of professional obligations and emotional turmoil. Sarah threw herself into her other patient's care, trying to maintain some distance from Michael's case. But she found herself drawn back to his room again and again, pulled by a connection she couldn't deny, even as she questioned its validity. Michael seemed to sense her withdrawal and responded with gentle patience. He didn't push for more intimate conversations or demand that she accept his version of their past. Instead, he simply shared small memories that seemed authentic in their specificity. The way she used to steal his French fries when she thought he wasn't looking. Her habit of reading the ending of mystery novels first, then pretending to be surprised. The face she made when she was concentrating on memorizing lines. These details felt true in a way that Sarah couldn't explain. They matched quirks and habits she still had. Personality traits that had survived whatever changes the accident had wrought. Slowly, carefully, she began to allow herself to believe that at least some of his memories might be real. It was during this tentative thaw in their relationship that Janet Walsh, the nurse supervisor, dropped another bombshell. She informed Sarah that Michael's insurance situation had been resolved, but not in the way anyone had hoped. His aunt, Mrs. Fairchild, had provided his identification and insurance information, but the coverage was limited. He would need to be discharged within the week. The thought of losing him again, just as she was beginning to remember what they might have meant to each other, filled Sarah with panic. She approached Dr. Hartwell about extending Michael's stay, but he was firm in his refusal. Sarah, you're too personally involved in this case, he said, with the bluntness of an old family friend. I allowed the initial extension as a favor, but I can't justify keeping him here indefinitely. He's medically stable and ready for discharge. That night, Sarah sat by Michael's bedside after her official shift ended, watching him sleep. In the dim light of the monitors, he looked younger, more like the college student she might have loved all those years ago. She tried to imagine what their life might have been like if the accident had never happened. Would they have married right after graduation? Would they have children by now? Would they have grown tired of each other? Or would their love have deepened with time? As if sensing her presence, Michael opened his eyes and smiled at her. Penny, for your thoughts. I was thinking about the life we lost, she admitted, wondering if we would have been happy. Michael was quiet for a long moment. I used to torture myself with those same questions, he said finally. But I've learned that happiness isn't about the life you didn't live. It's about finding meaning in the life you have. His words struck her with unexpected force. Sarah had spent so much of her adult life feeling like something was missing, searching for a sense of completeness she could never quite grasp. Her marriage to David had been comfortable but passionless, a relationship built on compatibility, rather than connection. She had always wondered if she was capable of the kind of deep love she read about in novels or saw in movies. Now, sitting beside this man who claimed to have loved her completely, Sarah began to understand that the emptiness she had carried might not be a personal failing. It might be grief for a love she couldn't remember losing. What happens when you leave here? She asked, dreading the answer. I don't know, Michael admitted. I've spent so many years focused on finding you that I never made plans for what would happen if I actually succeeded. Especially not like this, with you not remembering our past." The vulnerability in his voice made Sarah's heart ache. She reached for his hand without thinking, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that felt both foreign and familiar. "Maybe we could start over," she said softly. "Not trying to recapture what we lost, but building something new." Michael's eyes filled with hope and fear in equal measure. "Do you think that's possible? Can you love someone you don't remember loving?" Sarah didn't have an answer to that question, but she knew she wanted to try. The connection she felt with Michael transcended memory, reaching something deeper and more primitive than conscious thought. Whether it was the echo of old love or the beginning of something entirely new, she couldn't say. But she knew she wasn't ready to let him walk out of her life again. The decision to pursue a relationship with Michael wasn't made in a single moment of clarity. Instead, it emerged slowly over the remaining days of his hospitalization, built from small conversations and shared silences. Sarah found herself staying later each evening, sometimes bringing dinner to share in his room, sometimes just sitting together as they watched the sun set over the city. Dr. Peterson continued to express concern about her involvement, and Sarah's colleagues began to whisper more openly about her unusual attachment to the mysterious patient. But Sarah found she cared less about their opinions with each passing day. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive, connected to something larger than her professional obligations and daily routines. On Michael's last night in the hospital, Sarah brought a bottle of wine and 2 plastic cups, figuring that if she was going to break hospital protocol, she might as well do it thoroughly. They sat by the window in his room, watching the lights of Philadelphia twinkle like earthbound stars. "I need you to know," Michael said, swirling the wine in his cup, "that I don't expect anything from you. I know this situation is complicated, maybe impossible. If you decide you can't handle the uncertainty, I'll understand." Sarah studied his profile in the dim light, trying to imagine walking away from him now. The thought filled her with the same hollow ache she had carried for 15 years without understanding its source. What if I can't remember our past? What if I never get those memories back? "Then we'll make new ones," Michael said simply. "Better ones, maybe. We're not the same people we were at 21. We've both been shaped by loss and disappointment and growth. Maybe the love we build now will be stronger than the one we lost." His words carried a wisdom born from years of longing and acceptance. Sarah realized that he had already mourned the loss of their young love, had already made peace with the possibility that it might never be recovered. He wasn't asking her to become the girl she used to be. He was asking if she wanted to discover who they might become together. That night, Sarah made her choice, not based on memories she couldn't access or a past she couldn't change, but on the undeniable truth of what she felt in his presence. Whether it was love reborn or love newly discovered didn't matter. What mattered was that it was real, and it was hers to claim or reject. When Michael was discharged the next morning, Sarah was there to drive him to the small apartment Mrs. Fairchild had arranged for him across town. It wasn't much, just a studio in an old building with thin walls and a view of the parking lot. But it was a start. A place where they could begin again, slowly and carefully, without the weight of hospital protocols and professional boundaries. As they stood in the doorway of his new home, surrounded by the few belongings that represented his entire life, Sarah felt the magnitude of the choice she was making. She was choosing uncertainty over safety, possibility over protocol. She was choosing to love someone who remembered loving her, even though she couldn't remember loving him back. "Are you sure about this?" Michael asked, reading the uncertainty in her face. Sarah looked into his eyes, those eyes that had watched her for weeks while she couldn't remember being watched, and felt the last of her defenses crumble. "I'm sure I want to try." It wasn't the passionate declaration of undying love from the romance novels she read before bed. It wasn't the dramatic reunion she might have imagined if she had known to hope for one. But it was honest, and it was brave, and it was the beginning of something that might grow into the kind of love that survives amnesia and abandonment and 15 years of separation. As they stepped into his apartment together, Sarah felt like she was finally coming home to a place she had never known she was looking for. The feeling was so strong it made her dizzy, a sense of rightness that seemed to emanate from her bones. Whatever had been taken from her in that long-ago accident, whatever memories had been buried beneath the weight of trauma and time, this feeling was proof that love could survive even the most devastating losses. But even as hope bloomed in her chest, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that their story was far from over. There were still questions that needed answers, still secrets that hadn't been revealed. The note in Michael's pocket when he was brought to the hospital, the years he had spent searching for her, the exact circumstances that had brought him to that train station just blocks from where she worked, all of these pieces of the puzzle remained unsolved, and somewhere in the back of her mind, Sarah sensed that the biggest revelation was yet to come. The first weeks of Michael's recovery outside the hospital were a delicate dance of discovery and restraint. Sarah visited him most evenings after work, bringing takeout dinners and updates from the hospital that made him laugh. They talked for hours about everything except their past, as if by mutual agreement they had decided to let their present relationship develop without the pressure of lost memories. Michael's apartment gradually transformed from a sterile space into something that reflected his personality. Books appeared on improvised shelves, along with notebooks filled with his careful handwriting. He had returned to writing, he told Sarah, though he was cagey about the specifics of his work. Sometimes she would arrive to find him hunched over his laptop, completely absorbed, and he would quickly close it when she knocked. Dr. Emily Chen, Sarah's closest friend at the hospital and no relation to Michael, despite sharing his surname, noticed the change in Sarah immediately. Emily was a cardiologist with a sharp wit and an uncanny ability to read people's emotional states, skills that made her both an excellent doctor and a persistent friend. "You're glowing," Emily observed one afternoon as they grabbed coffee between surgeries. "And don't try to tell me it's a new skincare routine. I know love struck when I see it." Sarah felt her cheeks warm. "It's complicated. The best love stories usually are," Emily replied with a knowing smile. "Tell me about him. And don't leave out the juicy details." Sarah found herself describing Michael in terms that surprised her with their tenderness. The way he listened with complete attention when she spoke, as if her words were the most important thing in the world. How he remembered tiny details about her preferences and adjusted his behavior accordingly. The way he looked at her sometimes, with a mixture of wonder and sadness that made her chest tight. "He sounds perfect," Emily said when Sarah finished. "Which means there's something you're not telling me." Sarah hesitated, then decided her friend deserved the truth. She told Emily about the amnesia, the lost engagement, the years Michael had spent searching for her. Emily listened without interruption, her expression growing more concerned with each revelation. "Jesus, Sarah," Emily breathed when the story was complete. "That's not complicated. That's potentially dangerous. How do you know he's telling the truth about your past? How do you know he didn't orchestrate this whole situation?" The questions Emily raised were ones Sarah had been trying not to ask herself. In the warm glow of Michael's attention and the intoxicating feeling of connection she experienced in his presence, it was easy to forget the more troubling aspects of their situation. But Emily's concerns forced her to confront the uncomfortable possibility that she was being manipulated by someone who understood her vulnerabilities better than she understood them herself. "You think he's lying?" Sarah asked, though part of her already knew Emily was just voicing her own suppressed doubts. "I think people with traumatic brain injuries sometimes have difficulty distinguishing between fantasy and reality," Emily said gently. "And I think you've been lonely for so long that you might be willing to believe in a love story that sounds too good to be true." That night, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling of her apartment, Emily's words echoing in her mind. Was she being naive? Had her desperation for connection made her vulnerable to an elaborate delusion? The photographic evidence of their college relationship was real, but photographs only proved they had known each other, not that they had been engaged or deeply in love. The next evening, instead of visiting Michael's apartment, Sarah drove to the public library and spent hours researching traumatic brain injuries and their effects on memory and perception. What she found was disturbing. Patients with certain types of brain trauma could indeed develop elaborate false memories, especially about relationships and emotional connections. They could become convinced that casual acquaintances were intimate partners, that brief encounters were meaningful relationships. But as Sarah read case study after case study, she kept coming back to the specificity of Michael's memories about her. The details he knew weren't the kind of superficial observations that could be gleaned from watching someone from a distance. They were intimate, personal, the kind of knowledge that came from sharing daily life with someone. The doubt and certainty warred in her mind as she drove home through the quiet streets of Philadelphia. By the time she reached her apartment building, Sarah had made a decision. She needed more evidence, more proof that their relationship had been real. And she knew exactly where to find it. The next morning, Sarah called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. Instead of going to the hospital, she drove to her childhood home in the suburbs, a journey she rarely made anymore since her parents had moved to Florida. The house belonged to strangers now, but Sarah wasn't interested in the building itself. She was interested in what might be stored in the basement of her childhood friend's house next door. Jessica Murphy had been Sarah's best friend from kindergarten through high school, and their mothers had maintained the friendship even as their daughters drifted apart during college. When Mrs. Murphy had died 5 years earlier, Jessica had kept most of her mother's belongings in the basement, unable to throw away a lifetime of accumulated memories. Jessica was surprised but pleased to see Sarah at her door, and she readily agreed to let her search through the old boxes stored below. "Mom kept everything," Jessica warned as they descended into the musty basement. "Every Christmas card, every newspaper clipping, every photograph anyone ever gave her." The basement was an archaeologist's dream, boxes labeled by year and occasion stretching back decades. Sarah found what she was looking for in a box marked Sarah College Years 2007-2011, a collection her mother had apparently given to Mrs. Murphy for safekeeping. Inside the box were treasures Sarah had forgotten existed. Letters she had written home during her freshman year, describing her classes and new friends with the enthusiasm of someone experiencing independence for the first time. Photographs from various college events, including several from theater productions. And buried at the bottom of the box, a small velvet jewelry case that made Sarah's heart stop. Inside the case was an engagement ring. Not expensive or elaborate, clearly chosen by someone with more love than money, but beautiful in its simplicity. A single diamond surrounded by tiny sapphires, set in white gold that had been polished to a soft shine. Tucked beneath the ring was a folded piece of paper with Sarah's own handwriting. "Yes, 1,000 times yes, love Sarah. March 15th, 2011. Sarah sank into a dusty chair in the basement, the ring case trembling in her hands. Here was proof, undeniable and written in her own hand, that Michael's memories were real. They had been engaged. She had said yes to his proposal, had been excited enough to write about it, had cared enough to keep the ring even after losing her memories of him. But if the engagement had been real, why had her parents been so determined to erase it from her life? What had they seen in Michael, or their relationship, that had made them believe she was better off without him? Jessica found Sarah crying in the basement an hour later, still clutching the ring case. With infinite gentleness, she helped Sarah pack up the box and carry it to her car. Before Sarah left, Jessica shared a memory that provided another piece of the puzzle. "I remember when you were in the hospital after your accident," Jessica said quietly. "There was a boy who came to visit every day for weeks. The nurses said he would sit in the waiting room for hours, even when visiting hours were over. Your parents finally had to ask him to stop coming. They said it was too upsetting for him to see you when you couldn't remember him." The image of Michael as a heartbroken 21-year-old, sitting alone in a hospital waiting room day after day, hoping for a sign of recognition that never came, broke something open in Sarah's chest. She could see him so clearly in her mind, young and devastated, watching the love of his life look at him like a stranger. "What was he like?" Sarah asked through her tears. "Gentle," Jessica said without hesitation, "and completely devoted to you. I only met him a few times when you brought him home, but it was obvious he adored you. Mom always said he looked at you like you hung the moon." That evening, Sarah drove to Michael's apartment with the jewelry case in her purse and a heart full of questions. She found him cooking dinner in his tiny kitchen, humming a song she almost recognized. When he saw her, his face lit up with the same joy she had seen in the hospital, but it quickly shifted to concern when he noticed her emotional state. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, abandoning the stove to cup her face in his hands. Instead of answering, Sarah pulled out the jewelry case and set it on his small dining table. Michael's face went completely white when he saw it, and his hands shook as he opened the case to reveal the ring inside. "You kept it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't remember keeping it," Sarah said honestly. "I found it in a box of college things my mother had stored away, along with this." She handed him the note she had written, the enthusiastic acceptance of his proposal in her own handwriting. Michael read the note with tears streaming down his face, his thumb tracing over the faded ink as if it were sacred text. "You were so happy," he said softly. "When I proposed, you started crying and laughing at the same time. You said yes before I even finished asking the question." "Tell me about that day," Sarah said, settling into the chair across from him. "Tell me everything." Michael closed his eyes, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a memory that had been treasured and protected for 15 years. "It was spring break of our senior year. We had been talking about the future, about what would happen after graduation. I was terrified you were going to take a job in another city. that we would end up separated by distance and time. I had bought the ring with money I earned working at the campus bookstore, he continued, still holding the note like a lifeline. It wasn't much, but it was all I could afford. I carried it around for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment. Sarah found herself leaning forward, hungry for details that might trigger her own memories. Where did you propose? The campus rose garden, Michael said with a small smile. It was your favorite place to study when the weather was nice. I found you there one afternoon, sitting under the big oak tree with a book in your lap. You looked so beautiful in the spring sunlight that I couldn't wait another minute. I just dropped to my knee right there and asked you to marry me. The scene he described felt familiar in a way Sarah couldn't explain. Not quite memory, but something close to it. She could almost see the rose garden, almost feel the warmth of spring sunshine on her face. But the memory remained frustratingly out of reach, like trying to catch smoke with her bare hands. We were going to have a small wedding after graduation, Michael continued, his voice growing thick with emotion. Just our families and close friends. You wanted to wear your grandmother's dress, and we were going to honeymoon at that bed and breakfast in Maine you had seen in a magazine. We had it all planned out. Sarah felt tears sliding down her cheeks as she listened to the life they had planned together. A future that had been stolen by a moment of careless stagecraft and falling scenery. What happened after the accident? How did you find out I couldn't remember you? Michael's face darkened with old pain. I wasn't allowed to see you at first. The doctor said only family could visit while you were in the critical care unit. Your parents told me you were going to be fine, that you just needed time to heal. It wasn't until you were moved to a regular room that I learned about the memory loss. I brought flowers, he said quietly. Roses from the garden where I proposed. When I walked into your room, you looked at me like I was a complete stranger. You were polite, thanked me for the flowers, but there was no recognition in your eyes at all. It was like looking at a ghost of the person I loved. Sarah reached across the table to take his hand, wishing she could somehow absorb his pain and transform it into the memories she had lost. I'm so sorry. I can't imagine how that must have felt. Your parents asked me to leave, Michael continued. They said the doctors recommended keeping your environment as stress-free as possible while you recovered. They promised to call me when you were ready to see me again. But the call never came. The cruelty of it hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her parents had effectively erased Michael from her life, making the decision without her consent and without considering what she might have wanted. They had stolen not just her memories but her agency, treating her like a child, incapable of making her own choices about love and loss. I tried calling your house a few weeks later, Michael said. Your father answered. He told me you were doing well, but that you had made it clear you didn't want any contact with people from your college theater days. He said it was too painful for you, that it reminded you of the accident. Sarah felt sick imagining her father lying so smoothly, cutting Michael out of her life with surgical precision. That wasn't true. I would never have said that. I know that now, Michael said gently. But at the time, I thought I had to respect your wishes. I thought the best thing I could do for you was disappear. The weight of all those lost years pressed down on Sarah like a physical force. 15 years of Michael believing she had rejected him. 15 years of her feeling incomplete without understanding why. The tragedy of their separation was made worse by the knowledge that it had been preventable. A choice made by people who thought they knew better than the hearts they were breaking. How did you end up here? Sarah asked. What brought you to Philadelphia? Michael's expression grew complicated, a mixture of embarrassment and determination. I've been following your career for years, reading about your work in medical journals, tracking your presentations at conferences. I knew you worked at Philadelphia General, but I never had the courage to contact you directly. The revelation sent a chill down Sarah's spine. The idea that Michael had been watching her from a distance for years, following her career and movements, struck her as either romantic or deeply disturbing, depending on the perspective. I wasn't stalking you, Michael said quickly, reading the concern in her face. I just needed to know you were okay, that you had found happiness. I told myself I would never interfere with your life, but I couldn't let go completely. What changed? Sarah asked. What made you decide to come here now? Michael looked down at his hands, and when he spoke, his voice was barely audible. I found out about your divorce. I saw the notice in the newspaper, and I realized you might be as alone as I was. I thought maybe, if I could find a way to meet you naturally, you might give me a chance to explain what we had been to each other. The admission hung between them like a confession of a crime. Sarah felt her world tilting again as the implications sank in. Michael hadn't ended up in the emergency room by accident. He had come to Philadelphia specifically to find her, and somehow his presence at that train station had been part of a plan to reconnect. The collapse at the train station, Sarah said slowly. That wasn't an accident, was it? Michael's silence was answer enough. Sarah felt the bottom drop out of her stomach as she realized the truth. The mysterious patient with no identification, the note in his pocket, the convenient proximity to her hospital. It had all been orchestrated. Michael had created the entire scenario as a way to insert himself back into her life. How? She whispered, her voice hollow with shock. I've been having episodes, Michael admitted, his face flushed with shame. Fainting spells, probably stress-related. My doctor said it was anxiety manifesting as physical symptoms. That morning, I felt one coming on while I was waiting for the train. I knew I was going to collapse, and I knew someone would call an ambulance. The calculated nature of his deception hit Sarah like a slap. Every moment of their reconnection, every tender conversation and growing feeling of love, had been built on a foundation of lies. Michael hadn't found his way back to her through fate or coincidence. He had engineered their reunion, manipulating both her professional compassion and her emotional vulnerability to get close to her again. You used me, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger with anger. You knew I would be the doctor on duty in the emergency room that day? No, Michael said urgently. I had no way of knowing you would be my doctor. That part really was coincidence. I just knew that if I ended up at Philadelphia General, there was a chance I might see you. I never imagined you would be assigned to my case. But Sarah was no longer listening to his explanations. The trust she had been building, the love she had been allowing herself to feel, crumbled like a house of cards in a strong wind. How could she believe anything he said now? How could she trust her own feelings when they had been manipulated from the very beginning? I need you to leave, she said, standing abruptly from the table. Sarah, please, Michael pleaded, reaching for her hand. Let me explain. It wasn't manipulation. It was desperation. I've been carrying this love for 15 years, and I was dying from it. I just needed a chance to see you again, to find out if there was anything left between us. But Sarah was already moving toward the door, the engagement ring forgotten on the table between them. The revelation of Michael's deception had shattered something fundamental in her understanding of their relationship. Every tender moment, every growing feeling of connection, now seemed tainted by the knowledge that he had orchestrated their reunion from the beginning. Don't contact me again, she said without turning around. Don't come to the hospital. Don't call. Don't send letters. Whatever we had, whatever we might have had, it's over. Sarah left Michael's apartment and drove home through the city streets, her hands shaking on the steering wheel and tears blurring her vision. The night that had begun with the discovery of their engagement ring and the confirmation of their lost love had ended with the devastating revelation that everything she thought she knew about their reunion was a lie. But even as anger and betrayal burned in her chest, Sarah couldn't shake the memory of the pain in Michael's eyes when she walked away. The love he claimed to feel for her might be real, but it was a love built on obsession and manipulation, a love that had driven him to elaborate deception. How could she trust a man who would go to such lengths to insert himself back into her life? The answer, Sarah realized as she climbed the stairs to her empty apartment, was that she couldn't. The fairy tale reunion she had been allowing herself to believe in was just that, a fairy tale. And now she had to figure out how to live with the knowledge that the greatest love story of her life might have been nothing more than an elaborate fiction created by a man who couldn't let go of the past. The next few weeks passed in a blur of professional routine and emotional numbness. Sarah threw herself into her work with an intensity that worried her colleagues, taking extra shifts and volunteer assignments that kept her at the hospital for 14-hour days. Sleep brought no relief, only dreams of Michael's face when she had walked away from him, the mixture of love and desperation that had made her question her own certainty, even as she fled from him. Dr. Emily Chen finally cornered Sarah in the break room on a Thursday afternoon, physically blocking the door when Sarah tried to escape another well-meaning conversation about self-care and work-life balance. Okay, enough, Emily said, with the firm tone she usually reserved for non-compliant patients. You look like death warmed over, you're working yourself into the ground, and you haven't returned any of my calls in 3 weeks. Talk to me. Sarah sank into one of the plastic chairs that had seen better decades, suddenly too exhausted to maintain her protective walls. You were right about him. About everything. She told Emily about the engagement ring, about the planned manipulation of his collapse, about the 15 years Michael had spent watching her from a distance. Emily listened without interruption, her expression growing more concerned with each revelation. "Jesus, Sarah," Emily breathed when the story was complete. "I'm so sorry. I hoped I was wrong." "The worst part," Sarah said, her voice cracking with the effort of holding back tears, "is that some part of me still loves him. Even knowing what he did, even understanding how he manipulated the situation, I can't turn off my feelings like a switch." Emily reached across the small table to squeeze Sarah's hand. "That's not weakness. That's human nature. You formed a real connection with him, regardless of how it started. Those feelings don't disappear just because you discover uncomfortable truths about their origin." "How do I move forward?" Sarah asked. "How do I trust my own judgment again when I was so easily fooled?" "You weren't fooled," Emily said firmly. "You responded to what felt real because in many ways it was real. His feelings for you, however misguided his actions, seemed genuine. The connection you felt existed, even if it was built on a problematic foundation." But Emily's reassurance felt hollow to Sarah, who had spent sleepless nights questioning every moment of her relationship with Michael. Had any of it been authentic? When he looked at her with such tenderness, was he seeing her as she was now? Or was he projecting the memory of the girl she used to be? When she felt drawn to him, was it genuine attraction? Or just the echo of a love she couldn't remember? The questions tormented her during the day and haunted her dreams at night. Sarah found herself avoiding certain areas of the hospital where she might encounter reminders of Michael, taking different routes through the corridors and eating lunch in the cafeteria instead of the quiet break room where they had shared so many conversations. It was during one of these cafeteria lunches that Sarah encountered Mrs. Eleanor Fairchild, Michael's aunt, who appeared at her table with the tentative politeness of someone approaching a wild animal. The elderly woman looked frailer than Sarah remembered, her silver hair less carefully arranged, and her eyes red-rimmed with recent tears. "Dr. Mitchell, I hope you don't mind the intrusion," Mrs. Fairchild said, hovering uncertainly beside Sarah's table. "I was hoping we might have a word." Sarah's first instinct was to refuse, to protect herself from any further manipulation or emotional upheaval. But something in the older woman's demeanor, a vulnerability that seemed genuine, made her gesture to the empty chair across from her. "I know what Michael did was wrong," Mrs. Fairchild began without preamble. "The deception, the manipulation of his collapse, all of it. I've been furious with him ever since he told me the truth." Sarah felt a bitter satisfaction that at least someone in Michael's family understood the magnitude of his betrayal. "Then why are you here?" "Because I'm afraid he's going to do something desperate," Mrs. Fairchild said, her voice trembling with worry. "He's been in a terrible state since you ended things between you. He's not eating, not sleeping, barely speaking. I found him yesterday sitting in his car outside the hospital at 3 in the morning, just staring at the building." The image of Michael sitting alone in a dark parking lot, tormented by his own actions and their consequences, sent an unwelcome pang of sympathy through Sarah's chest. She pushed the feeling away, reminding herself that his current suffering was the direct result of his choices. "I'm sorry he's struggling," Sarah said carefully, "but I can't be responsible for his emotional state. What he did was unforgivable." "Was it?" Mrs. Fairchild asked quietly. "I'm not excusing his methods, Dr. Mitchell, but can you honestly say that what he did was worse than what your parents did to both of you 15 years ago?" The comparison hit Sarah like a physical blow. In her anger and hurt over Michael's deception, she had somehow forgotten the greater betrayal that had set all of this in motion. Her parents had stolen her memories, her choice, her chance to fight for a love she had apparently treasured enough to keep the engagement ring all these years. "That's different," Sarah protested, though even as she said it, she wasn't sure she believed it. "Is it?" Mrs. Fairchild pressed gently. "Your parents made a choice about your life without your consent, erasing a relationship they deemed inappropriate. Michael made a choice about his life without your consent, engineering a reunion he deemed necessary. Both actions were wrong, but both were motivated by love." Sarah wanted to argue, to maintain the clear moral distinction between victim and manipulator that had sustained her anger for the past 3 weeks. But Mrs. Fairchild's words forced her to confront the uncomfortable possibility that the situation was more complex than she had allowed herself to believe. "He's been seeing a therapist," Mrs. Fairchild continued, "working through his obsession and his inability to let go of the past. He knows what he did was wrong, and he's trying to understand why he felt justified in doing it." "It's too late for therapy to fix this," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. Mrs. Fairchild studied Sarah's face with the shrewd intelligence of someone who had spent decades reading people's true feelings. You still love him. It wasn't a question, and Sarah didn't bother denying it. The love she felt for Michael existed independently of his actions, a connection that transcended logic and moral judgment. She could condemn his choices while still aching for his presence, could feel betrayed by his deception while still longing for his touch. Love isn't enough, Sarah said finally. Trust is the foundation of any relationship, and he destroyed that. Trust can be rebuilt, Mrs. Fairchild said softly, if both people are willing to do the work. After Mrs. Fairchild left, Sarah sat alone in the cafeteria for a long time, staring out the window at the city beyond. The conversation had stirred up emotions she had been trying to suppress, forcing her to confront the possibility that her black and white view of Michael's betrayal might be more nuanced than she wanted to admit. That evening, for the first time in weeks, Sarah found herself driving past Michael's apartment building. She didn't stop, didn't even slow down, but she saw his car in the parking lot and noticed that his windows were dark despite the early hour. The thought of him sitting alone in that small space, consumed by guilt and regret, made her chest tight with unwanted sympathy. Over the next few days, Sarah found herself thinking more and more about Mrs. Fairchild's words. The parallel between Michael's deception and her parents' betrayal became harder to ignore. Both had been acts of manipulation disguised as protection. Both had denied her agency in making her own choices about love and loss. But there was a crucial difference, Sarah realized. Her parents had acted to prevent her from making what they saw as a mistake. Michael had acted to give her a chance to make an informed choice, even if his methods were deeply flawed. They had stolen her memories. He had tried to help her create new ones. The distinction felt important, though Sarah wasn't sure what to do with it. She was still hurt by his deception, still felt manipulated and betrayed. But underneath the anger, a different emotion was growing. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. Michael's actions were wrong, but they were the actions of a man driven to desperation by 15 years of loss and longing. It was this growing understanding that led Sarah to make a decision that surprised even her. On a cold Saturday morning in early December, she drove to Michael's apartment building and knocked on his door for the first time since learning the truth about his deception. Michael answered the door looking like a man who had been systematically destroying himself through neglect and self-punishment. His clothes hung loose on his frame. His face was gaunt with exhaustion, and his eyes held a hollow quality that reminded Sarah uncomfortably of her own reflection during the worst days of her divorce. "Sarah," he breathed, her name a prayer and a question and an expression of disbelief all at once. "We need to talk," she said simply, and stepped into his apartment without waiting for an invitation. The space looked like it belonged to someone who had given up on the future. Takeout containers accumulated on every surface. Books lay open and abandoned in random piles, and the laptop where he had been writing was closed and covered with dust. The man who had carefully cultivated hope during his weeks in the hospital had clearly surrendered to despair. "You look terrible," Sarah said bluntly, settling into the same chair where she had discovered his deception weeks earlier. "I feel worse," Michael admitted, sinking onto the couch across from her. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. What I did was inexcusable. I've been trying to understand how I could have justified such manipulation, and I don't have any good answers." Sarah studied his face, noting the genuine remorse in his expression. This wasn't the calculated manipulation she had feared, but raw, honest self-flagellation. Whatever therapy he was receiving was clearly forcing him to confront some uncomfortable truths about his behavior. "Your aunt came to see me," Sarah said. "She's worried about you." Michael's face flushed with embarrassment. "I told her not to contact you. I'm sorry if she made you uncomfortable." "She made me think," Sarah said honestly, "about what you did, and about what my parents did, and about the difference between the two." Hope flickered in Michael's eyes, quickly suppressed as if he was afraid to nurture it. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just need you to know that whatever my methods were, my feelings for you are real. They always have been." Sarah felt the familiar pull of connection that had drawn her to him from the beginning, the inexplicable sense that she was finally in the presence of someone who truly saw her. Even knowing about his deception, even understanding the calculated nature of their reunion, she couldn't deny the authenticity of what existed between them in this moment. "I believe you," she said quietly, and watched relief flood his features. "But belief isn't the same as trust. And without trust, we can't have a relationship." "I know," Michael said, his voice barely audible. "I know I destroyed any chance we might have had. I just couldn't live with the regret anymore. I had to try, even if it meant risking everything. The honesty in his admission broke something open in Sarah's chest. She could see the man he might have been if their story had unfolded differently, if they had been allowed to grow and change together instead of spending 15 years apart. But she could also see the man he had become through loss and obsession, someone capable of elaborate deception in service of a love that had become more fantasy than reality. "I don't know if we can fix this," Sarah said finally. "I don't know if I can learn to trust you again, or if you can learn to love the person I am now instead of the memory of who I used to be." "I want to try," Michael said urgently. "If you're willing to give me a chance, I want to do whatever it takes to earn your trust back." Sarah looked into his eyes and saw 15 years of longing, weeks of manipulation, and genuine remorse, all tangled together in a knot so complex she wasn't sure it could ever be untied. But underneath all of that, she saw something else. She saw love, flawed and obsessive and desperately misguided, but real nonetheless. The question was whether love like that was worth the risk of trusting again, whether the possibility of healing could justify the certainty of more pain, whether two people who had been shaped by loss and betrayal could find their way back to each other, or if they were destined to remain forever changed by the trauma of their separation. As Sarah sat in Michael's apartment, surrounded by the evidence of his despair and the weight of their shared history, she realized that the biggest revelation wasn't behind them after all. It was sitting right in front of her, waiting to be unwrapped like a gift that might contain either treasure or destruction. The choice of what to do with that gift was entirely hers to make. Sarah looked at Michael sitting across from her, broken and desperate, and made a choice that surprised them both. "I'm willing to try," she said quietly. "But we start over completely. No assumptions based on our past, no expectations built on memories I can't access. We get to know each other as the people we are now." Hope bloomed in Michael's eyes like sunrise after the longest night. "Anything you want, any conditions you need." "Therapy," Sarah said firmly. "Both of us, together and separately. We need professional help to navigate this, to understand why you felt justified in manipulating our reunion, and why I'm willing to forgive you for it." Over the following weeks, they began the delicate work of rebuilding trust from nothing. Michael started attending individual therapy sessions twice a week, working to understand the obsessive patterns that had driven him to such extreme measures. Sarah began her own counseling, exploring why she had felt so incomplete for 15 years, and how the trauma of lost memories had shaped her adult relationships. Their joint sessions were brutal and necessary, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about love and manipulation, agency, and choice. Dr. Rachel Martinez, their couples therapist, didn't let either of them hide behind romantic notions or victimhood narratives. "Love without respect is obsession," Dr. Martinez told Michael during one particularly difficult session. "And forgiveness without accountability is enabling. You both need to understand the difference." But slowly, carefully, something new began to grow between them. Not the passionate young love they had lost, but something more mature and deliberate. Sarah found herself appreciating Michael's gentle humor and deep intelligence, while he learned to see her as she was now, stronger and more independent than the college student he had idealized. 3 months into their careful courtship, the revelation that would change everything came from an unexpected source. Sarah received a call from her mother, Helen, who had been following Sarah's life from Florida with the anxious attention of someone who knew she had made terrible mistakes. "There's something I need to tell you," Helen said, her voice heavy with decades of guilt. "About the accident, about Michael, about why we were so determined to keep you apart." Sarah felt her blood turn cold. "What are you talking about?" "The accident wasn't an accident," Helen said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "It was Michael's fault. He was the one who insisted on adjusting the set piece that fell. The other students warned him it wasn't secure, but he was so focused on making the production perfect for you that he ignored their concerns." The admission hit Sarah like a physical blow. Michael had caused the accident that destroyed her memories, that stole their future together. He had been responsible for his own loss, for the 15 years of separation that had driven him to such desperate measures. "We couldn't tell you," Helen continued, crying now. "You were so badly hurt, and he was so devastated by what he had done. We thought it would be kinder to let you forget him entirely than to remember him as the person who had hurt you." Sarah ended the call and sat in her apartment, staring at the wall as the implications crashed over her. Every conversation with Michael, every moment of growing trust, had been built on another foundation of deception. He knew he had caused her injuries, knew he was responsible for her memory loss, and he had never told her. When she confronted Michael that evening, his face went white with terror and something that looked like relief. "You know," he said simply. "How long have you remembered?" Sarah demanded, her voice shaking with rage and betrayal. "Since the first week in the hospital," Michael admitted. "The memories came back gradually as I recovered. I remembered the rehearsal, the argument about the set piece, the moment I realized it was falling toward you. And you said nothing," Sarah said, her voice deadly quiet. "You let me fall in love with you again, knowing you were the reason I couldn't remember loving you the first time." "I was terrified," Michael said desperately. "I knew that if you learned the truth, you would never forgive me. I thought maybe if I could make you love me again, if I could prove that we belonged together, then maybe the cause of the accident wouldn't matter." But Sarah was already moving toward the door, her trust shattered beyond repair. The man she had been learning to love again was not just manipulative but cowardly, hiding the most fundamental truth about their relationship behind layers of deception and self-serving justification. "Don't follow me," she said without turning around. "Don't contact me. Don't send your aunt to plead your case. Don't engineer any more convenient accidents. We're done. Forever this time." The weeks that followed were the darkest period of Sarah's adult life. She felt like a fool for believing in their reunion, for allowing herself to hope that love could overcome the damage they had both sustained. The revelation that Michael had caused her original injuries added another layer of betrayal that seemed impossible to process. Dr. Martinez continued to see Sarah individually, helping her work through the complex emotions of loving someone who had harmed her twice, in completely different ways, separated by 15 years. "Trauma bonding is a real phenomenon," Dr. Martinez explained during one session. "Sometimes we're drawn to the very people who have hurt us, especially when that hurt is mixed with genuine care and affection." "So what I felt for him was just psychological manipulation?" Sarah asked bitterly. "Not necessarily," Dr. Martinez said carefully. "Feelings can be real even when their foundation is problematic. The question is whether those feelings are worth the cost of maintaining them." Sarah threw herself back into her work, taking on research projects and teaching responsibilities that kept her mind occupied. But she couldn't escape the sense that something essential had been lost. Not just her relationship with Michael, but her faith in her own judgment. It was Emily who finally forced Sarah to confront the truth she had been avoiding. 6 weeks after the final revelation about the accident, Emily cornered Sarah in the hospital parking garage after another 14-hour shift. "This isn't grief," Emily said bluntly. "This is self-punishment. You're acting like Michael's deceptions somehow prove that you're incapable of love or unworthy of being loved." "Maybe I am," Sarah said tiredly. "Maybe my parents were right to erase him from my life, and maybe I was stupid to think we could rebuild something from the wreckage. Or maybe," Emily said with the patience of a true friend, "love is always a risk, and the fact that you were brave enough to take that risk twice with the same person proves something important about your capacity for forgiveness and growth." That night, Sarah found herself thinking about Michael's face during their last confrontation. Underneath the fear and desperation, she had seen something else. Relief. The relief of someone who had finally stopped carrying a secret that was eating him alive. For the first time since learning about his role in the accident, Sarah allowed herself to imagine what those 15 years must have been like for him. Knowing he had destroyed the love of his life through his own arrogance and perfectionism. Carrying the guilt of her injuries alongside the grief of losing her. Living with the knowledge that his attempts to create something beautiful for her had resulted in the worst tragedy of both their lives. The realization didn't excuse his deceptions, but it helped Sarah understand them. Michael hadn't just been obsessed with reclaiming their lost love. He had been trying to find redemption for a mistake that had haunted him for 15 years. Understanding wasn't forgiveness, but it was a step towards something that might eventually become forgiveness. Sarah began to consider the possibility that their story might not be over, that there might be a way forward that acknowledged all the harm that had been done while still allowing for the possibility of healing. The decision to see Michael again came suddenly, triggered by a conversation with an elderly patient who was dying alone in the ICU. Mrs. Patterson had been unconscious for days when she suddenly opened her eyes and grabbed Sarah's hand with surprising strength. "Don't waste it," the old woman whispered urgently. "Whatever it is you're afraid of losing, don't waste it out of pride or fear. I wasted 40 years being angry at my sister over something that doesn't matter anymore. Now she's gone and I'm dying alone." Mrs. Patterson passed away that night, and Sarah found herself standing in the hospital chapel at 3 in the morning, thinking about love and forgiveness and the terrible brevity of human life. She thought about Michael sitting alone in his apartment, probably torturing himself with the same guilt that had driven him to such desperate measures. She thought about the 15 years they had already lost, and the question of whether they could afford to lose any more. The next morning, Sarah drove to Michael's apartment for what she told herself would be the last time. She found him packing boxes, preparing to leave Philadelphia entirely. "I'm going back to California," he said, when he saw her in his doorway. "I think it's better for both of us if I disappear again. Cleanly this time, without any deceptions or manipulations." "Is that what you want?" Sarah asked, studying his face. "What I want doesn't matter anymore," Michael said sadly. "I've hurt you too much, in too many ways. The kindest thing I can do is let you move on with your life." Sarah stepped into his apartment and closed the door behind her. "What if I don't want to move on? What if I want to try to move forward instead?" Hope and fear warred in Michael's expression. "Sarah, you can't possibly forgive what I've done. The accident, the deception, all of it. I don't deserve forgiveness." "You're right," Sarah said quietly. "You don't deserve forgiveness. But maybe I need to give it anyway. Not for you, but for me. Because carrying this anger and hurt is destroying me just like carrying guilt and obsession was destroying you." Over the next hour, they talked more honestly than they ever had before. Michael told her about the 15 years of therapy he had undergone, trying to process his guilt over the accident. How he had become a writer partly as a way to create endings for their story, writing novel after novel about couples who found their way back to each other against impossible odds. Sarah told him about the emptiness she had carried for 15 years, the sense that something essential was missing from her life. How her marriage to David had been an attempt to fill that void with someone safe and uncomplicated, and how its failure had forced her to confront the fact that she was still waiting for something she couldn't name. "I think we're both broken people," Sarah said finally. "Broken by the same tragedy, in different ways. Maybe that's why we keep finding each other. Maybe broken people are the only ones who can understand each other well enough to heal." "What are you saying?" Michael asked, afraid to hope. "I'm saying that love isn't about deserving or not deserving. It's about choosing to build something together despite all the reasons why you shouldn't. And I'm choosing you, Michael. Not because you've earned it, but because I can't imagine my life without the possibility of us." The kiss they shared was nothing like the passionate reunions of romance novels. It was tentative and careful, flavored with tears and the knowledge of how much they had both been hurt. But it was real, and it was theirs, and it was a beginning. Their healing didn't happen overnight. It took months of continued therapy, of learning to trust each other with small truths before they could handle the larger ones. Michael had to learn to love Sarah as she was now, not as an idealized memory of who she used to be. Sarah had to learn to forgive not just Michael's deceptions, but her own family's betrayals, and to trust her own capacity for judgment and love. They were married on a quiet Tuesday in April, exactly 1 year after their reunion in the ICU. No elaborate ceremony, no dramatic declarations, just a simple exchange of vows in Dr. Martinez's office with Emily and Mrs. Fairchild as witnesses. "I promise to love you in truth," Michael said, slipping a simple gold band onto Sarah's finger. "Not the truth I want to believe, but the truth of who you are in this moment. I promise to choose you," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her tears. "Not because our love is easy or convenient or pure, but because it's ours, and it's worth fighting for." As they walked out of the courthouse hand in hand, Sarah felt something she had been missing for 15 years click into place. Not the return of lost memories, but the creation of new ones. Not the recovery of a perfect young love, but the building of something more mature and durable. Their love story wasn't the fairy tale she might have dreamed of as a young woman. It was messy and complicated, built on a foundation of mistakes and betrayals, and hard-won forgiveness. But it was real, and it was theirs, and it had taught them both that sometimes the most beautiful things grow in the spaces where other things have been broken. 6 months later, as Sarah lay in Michael's arms in the small house they had bought together just outside the city, she felt the peace that comes from finally being exactly where you belong. Not because fate or destiny had brought them together, but because they had chosen each other repeatedly, through doubt and anger, and the terrible knowledge of how much they could hurt each other. "Do you ever wish you could remember?" Michael asked softly, his fingers tracing patterns on her back. "Our first time together, the way we were before?" Sarah considered the question, thinking about the young woman she had been and the naive love they had shared. "No," she said finally. "I think what we have now is better. We chose each other with our eyes wide open, knowing exactly what we were risking. That makes it more precious than any perfect memory could be. Michael pulled her closer, and Sarah felt the deep contentment that comes from being truly known by another person. They had lost 15 years, but they had found something more valuable in return. They had learned that love isn't about destiny or perfection or the absence of harm. It's about choosing to build something beautiful together, even when you know it might break again. And as they fell asleep in each other's arms, two people who had been shaped by loss and betrayal and the terrible fragility of human memory, Sarah knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Not because their love was perfect, but because it was real, and it was strong, and it had survived everything that had tried to destroy it. In the morning, they would wake up and choose each other again, and the morning after that, and the morning after that, for as long as they both drew breath, because that, Sarah realized, was what love really was. Not a feeling that struck like lightning, but a choice made new each day, a promise kept not once, but over and over again, until keeping it became as natural as breathing. And in choosing each other, again and again, they had found their way home.